So in this next conversation, we're going to turn to the impact of pesticide use on pollinators and our food and agriculture systems. And I'd like to introduce our moderator and longtime friend and my other favorite journalist. I misspoke before. I have two favorite journalists, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food, drink, and agriculture at Forbes. Give her a round of applause. She's my favorite. Joining her, we have Dr. Judy Wu Smart, an associate professor and extension specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome her, please. Dan Raichel, the director of Pollinators and Pesticides and Nature at NRDC. A round of applause, please. Dr. Leslie Ries, who is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Georgetown University. Round of applause. And Dr. Kathy Nolan, the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility in New York. Chloe, my friend, who I love, over to you.
Okay, hello Climate Week. So we're gonna do a lot of bridging the gaps right now because pollination really is so crucial to honestly everything we've been talking about today. And so this pesticide conversation we're gonna be having, right? Because pesticides are killing our soil, making it harder to have soil health, exist and permeate. And showcase that beautiful biodiversity we all need in our food system. And when you actually understand how much pollination, how much we struggle for it, but also how much pollination we need for many of the foods we eat, that food waste stuff becomes even more staggering to me personally. There are so many other inputs you just really don't understand exist. And when we're talking about this, like roughly a third of the produce we eat all need pollination. That's everything from carrots and onions to berries, nuts, apples. It's roughly, around the top 100 flowering crops that we have out there, the most popular flowering crops. Some 80 of them need pollination. And yields are impacted by a lot of crops, even if they don't require pollination. And so that's also kind of one of these kind of unfortunate ironies here because the industrial agriculture system, which is hurting pollination from using all these pesticides. Soybeans need pollination to increase yield, so does alfalfa and grass-fed beef producers, and this really all is very intertwined. So I think everyone here is very well aware of what colony collapse is. I'm sure you've at least heard it once. Just to tee us up with one more stat, 150 million acres in this country are sprayed by pesticides. That is serious. It is an astounding amount. And with that, I'd love to have all of these amazing panelists, share why this is important to your work, and particularly why, getting pesticides out of our farming is so crucial to the future of food, especially as we think about it, as how we can all survive climate crisis and dignity.
Okay. It's been great to be here. I think the focus on regenerative ag and soil health has been an incredible discussion and really important focus. But I do think that people have to understand that I caution that the benefits that we see from these impacts are threatened by systemic pesticide pollution. And so there's a lot of issues that we still need to improve on and really kind of think of the permeating factors that are contributing to the decline of the entire system. I'm in Nebraska, where more recently 98% of the unviable, unmarketed pesticide-treated seeds throughout North America was being funneled into our state as disposal through ethanol production. And the practice led to a lot of byproduct waste that was highly contaminated with pesticides and a mixture of these compounds that were then being distributed to farmers as soil conditioners and utilized on their properties without knowledge of those contaminants. And while this is kind of an isolated case in Nebraska, the concerns about and surrounding disposal of treated seeds is really still unclear. It's stopped in our state, but where is it occurring now? And that's still a big kind of concern for us because the ramifications and the ecological impacts of what we saw happening in our local region was pretty widespreading, from bees to amphibians to birds to the humans that were living in these communities. And so this is not just a pollinator problem. It's a One Health problem, and that really, if you're not familiar with that term, it just basically means that these grand challenges really are the conditions and the environment, the human health and wildlife health are so interconnected that we really shouldn't be looking at it with one lens. We have to be looking at it as a system.
And, you know, I can say in our work, so my job, I'm an attorney with NRDC, and I direct our pollinators work. And increasingly, over the years, we've come to focus on pesticides as one of the key driving issues behind pollinator loss, and in particular, a class of pesticides known as the neonicotinoids. And this relates to the treated seeds that Judy was talking about. So with the neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, we see one of the most ecologically destructive pesticides since DDT. And there's multiple reasons for that. One, these are some of the most potent insecticides ever created. They've made U.S. agriculture anywhere between 10 and 50 times more harmful to insect life. And the coating, the neonic coating on one seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees, just to give you a sense of scale, right?
Wow.
The second issue with neonics is they're used on an unprecedented scale, right? Up to 150 million acres, probably more nationwide when you can count total use. This is one of the largest deployments of insecticides in U.S. history, and it's happening year after year after year. And then the third issue with neonics, and this was the major innovation with neonics, is that they're systemic insecticides, which means they are designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the pollen, the root, the nectar, and basically to make the plant itself the pesticide. And that allows them to be literally painted on seeds. And the idea is, as that plant is growing, it soaks up the pesticides through its roots and becomes toxic. The problem is only 2 to 5% get into that target plant. The other 95+% stay in the soil. They persist for years and years and years. And those same properties that let the pesticides get into the plant means that anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation for lawn applications, every time you water your lawn, those pesticides are moving through the environment. They're contaminating new soil. If there are plants in that new soil, those plants soak up the pesticides. They become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply, that becomes polluted. And the sum total effect is we now have massive contamination from year over year use, toxicity building up in the soil over a huge area and expanding every time it rains into every nook and cranny of our ecosystem, and by the way, our bodies as well. And that's a huge problem. We saw it with pollinators, right? Pollinators were the canary in the coal mine, but there is a much larger hollowing out of biodiversity and threats to our human health that is going on with these pesticides, neonics sort of being the chief among them, but certainly not the only ones.
Yes, and I'll pick up on that. I'm a global change ecologist focused on insects. And, you know, we're talking here about pollinators, but insects actually perform so many different ecosystem services. We were talking earlier about healthy soils, just recycling nutrients into the soil. They're the base of the animal food chain. Insects outweigh all terrestrial vertebrates put together, and that includes people and livestock. So we can't really minimize all the values that insects have, and we've just gotten more and more evidence of this global decline of insects over the past 20 to 50 years. And that's not just, you know, very sensitive species and very, you know, conservation associated habitats. It's like the most common species. And one of the things that's really kind of floated to the top are these neonicotinoids. But we also know that it is lots of different factors that interact with each other. We call it death by 1,000 cuts. And so one thing I always like to really stress is that we can't really look at these dynamics and understand them unless we have the data to be able to, you know, look at these factors on a very large scale. And they've stopped reporting on neonicotinoid use in the US back in 2015. And so like the studies I've done have to stop in 2014. We can't go into the future, but we know the last 10 years have been the hottest on record. So I can't say like what's the general relative contribution of climate versus pesticides versus how those interact with each other, because if we don't have the data, we can't know.
but we can know that we can take one of these things out at a time, and we can start with neonics because everything that everybody has said isn't enough to describe how toxic these chemicals are. Neonicotinoid means new nicotine-like compound. So these are like nicotines that were thought to be able to target insects, but they don't. They kill worms and beetles and everything that would be in healthy soil. So farmers need to be pushing to get these chemicals out of their crops, out of their fields. But instead, they're being encouraged to use them and to use them prophylactically, which means to put them on the seed and have that in the field when there's no infestation. Now, we've learned in medicine over many years that using antibiotics prophylactically, one, presents more harm to the patient potentially, and two, can breed resistance. Well, the same thing turns out to be true in terms of using these neonics prophylactically. They are more harmful then in their effects as they spread throughout the environment and are consumed by us, and they also can breed resistance to the use of this class of insecticides. Humans can be harmed by these compounds. We know that because they're nicotine-like. And if you expose somebody to a nicotine acutely or chronically, it's really bad for you. When these chemicals get into the water and into the food that we eat, they are building up in our bodies. Studies done of pregnant women in the Northeast show that more and more women over time are showing up with positive serum levels for these compounds, and they're higher and higher. And the highest levels are in Hispanic women. Now, we don't know if that's because there's a large number of the farming community that are being measured there, or whether it's a social justice issue. Because if you eat organically, you eat organic food, you are probably going to experience far lower exposures to neonics and other insecticides. And so the community that's showing up high may be being exposed to more food that is conventionally grown and more food that is potentially contaminated from nearby sources. The initial studies that showed wildlife were being impacted were deer out in the West were being reported to the wildlife authorities for having congenital abnormalities and being small and being stillborn, being found by hunters. And studies were done, and in the wild, deer were provided with water that had a neonic in it in increasing doses. And the more of the neonic that they were given, the more likely they were to show exactly those findings. Wow. Very similar findings in case control studies in humans. So I am a pediatrician by training. I'm very worried that we have increasing levels of a compound where we know it's toxic and it's building up year over year. If we don't stop, we're going to see the same types of things that those hunters saw.
And not to hop in, but to hop in. The study that Kathy mentioned about pregnant women, hundreds of pregnant women measured across the country. The top line number there is over 95% of them had neonics in their bodies, and again, those levels increasing every year. So this is an issue that, whether you know it or not, affects all of us.
Yeah, Dan, you said the phrase canary in a coal mine earlier. I want to dig into that more, that from a health perspective, but also from a broader climate perspective. What is the most surprising piece of information about this problem that each of you have learned, more recently? I think you're so on the ground here that, I think you've got knowledge to drop on us.
Well, I think we can start with that study. And what is also, what really shocked me was sort of another study that was done in the wild. So after the study Kathy mentioned about the controlled study with deer and neonics, the refrain from industry was, well, you fed these deer a bunch of neonics. This is not what they're really exposed to in the real world. And so the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources went out and they collected spleens from hunters. Imagine 800 deer spleens moving through the mail, right? And then they tested those spleens because that was what the study looked for, neonics in the spleen. And they found In 2019, 2/3 of deer across Minnesota had neonics in their bodies. Didn't matter what environment, rural, urban. They all about 2/3 with 1/3 at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Burheim study. They did that study 2 years later. Those numbers jumped. Virtually all deer in Minnesota that they tested had neonics in their bodies, with 2/3 at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Burheim study. This study was done just 2 years later. And so, as Leslie mentioned, we don't have very good data on treated seed use, but everything that is indicating, the studies that we have is showing that these are actually building up in our environment, that the problem is actually getting worse. And that study shocked me.
Yeah, there was a study that came out recently where they just went out to nurseries and bought a bunch of, plants that you would plant in your garden, and found that the vast majority of them had neonicotinoids in them. And so, to me, what I think comes out of this is just how much this has penetrated into the environment in a relatively short amount of time. It was in the early 2000s that these seed treatments really came into wide use. And so it's just such a short amount of time. And for me, and I study butterflies just because we have the most data on butterflies than any other insect, even the most common butterflies, the common weedy white butterflies that you guys probably see flying around, New York City, those are all declining too. Like, it's not just, again, the rare species. It's like everything is going down.
There was just a study done and published in the past couple of weeks that is looking at the relationship of cancer to insecticides. And that showed an association. But I'm more concerned with the types of effects that neonics can have on humans, because they can be more subtle. So in those case control studies, there were 2 congenital abnormalities that are both very severe abnormalities: tetralogy of Fallot, which is malformation of the heart, and anencephaly, which is the absence of the growth of the brain, which is a lethal condition. Tetralogy of Fallot can now be treated in many instances. But the anencephaly makes sense in terms of these being neurotoxic. They also seem to have this developmental impact by being endocrine disruptive compounds, which means they can be potent at very low doses. But the other finding was if increased in neurologic conditions that were on the autism spectrum and hyperactivity. These can be very hard to sort out from all the other kinds of environmental impacts that children can be subjected to. But to see them in populations that are exposed to these chemicals above the baseline, I think we're talking about actually feeding ourselves and our children nicotine. That is not something that, if you spent your life trying to get people to stop smoking, that you want to do. And bees, if you offer them a plant that has nicotinoids on it and another plant that doesn't, they will get addicted to the plant that has the neonicotinoids on it.
Wow.
So why aren't we paying attention?
If they don't die, right? So going back to the canaries in the coal mine, I just wanted to make 2 points that oftentimes we think of bees as being that service. And honeybees are often the ones that we look at as our model system, but they are just a managed livestock species that do not well represent what we have in nature in wild pollinators that tend to be more sensitive and more vulnerable for a number of reasons. But the other counter argument I hear a lot is, well, bee colonies the number of colonies and their loss rate seems to be pretty stable. And so that is not an alarm. And I want people to recognize that the effort that beekeepers put into their operations to combat these losses, they put in time, they put in labor, they put in a lot of effort to recover from those losses. But it comes at a cost. The colonies are becoming less productive. They're becoming less resilient to pests and diseases. They are becoming less resilient and adaptable to extreme weather conditions. So it's not a really good metric to really understand the extent of the issue. So I would just want to emphasize that not only do we need to protect and support the future of farmers, but we also really have to be advocating for beekeepers. They are struggling, and it is often something that is not recognized.
Absolutely. There's actually a crazy consolidation within there's only, a handful of the managed beekeepers out there that actually maintain, 88% plus of all the bees that we need for pollinating all of these plants.
Yes.
It's the most beekeepers are small scale, but the actual most of the plants are only handled by like 2 or 3.
Yes.
Fascinating stuff. And I think also just to say, we'd be remiss not to say that the consolidation in seed and pesticides is part of the problem here. We were talking about that with soil health. It's also a connection. We don't have too much time, so I want to end on something else, but I want to take like 20, 30 seconds to say there is momentum happening with pesticide use from the policy perspective. Can we give like 15, 20 seconds on what's been happening, but also where the U.S. is still lagging?
Yeah, so it's tough in 15 seconds, but
Do your best.
So we know, and this is sort of funny and maybe fortunate, that the largest uses of these pesticides across the country, this is the coatings on corn, soybean, wheat seeds, other field crops, they are not providing economic benefits to farmers. So really the only folks that are benefiting are the chemical companies, which by the way are the same companies that make the seeds, and they give it to a package and often give farmers no choice in terms of whether the pesticide comes on the seed or not. We just had a major breakthrough in New York with the passage of the Birds and Bees Protection Act, a bill we've worked on for years. Yeah, some folks that helped out with that work. And that is the first law in the country that addresses the use of these pesticide-treated seeds, and it does so in a really innovative way, but I don't have time to talk about it.
Well, so there has been momentum, though, in other places.
And,
in the world.
and other states taking action, but we think that the Birds and Bees Protection Act is really sort of the national model for how to deal with the seed issue, which again is the largest and most needless use of these pesticides.
Absolutely.
And unregulated.
And unregulated at the state and federal government.
Yes.
Scary stuff. Well, we have no time, but let's all go around and say a call to action. We'd be remiss not to have you amazing people not share a call to action here today.
Yeah, I'm actually going to say that if you filter your water and you buy organic, that you can reduce your exposure to these, and talk to everybody you know to tell them to pass laws like we have here in New York State.
I'm going to say get involved with local nature centers, learn your local biodiversity, and maybe become a citizen scientist working on one of the many monitoring programs, because that's how we get enough data to answer these questions on a large scale.
I'll echo Kathy. I mean, reach out to your elected officials, not just the federal officials, but also your state officials. Because when they get a call from their constituents, they listen and tell them that you want action on this issue. We've found that the popular momentum here is what allowed us to overcome the very powerful opposition from the industry. It matters, hugely matters. Reach out to your elected officials.
Plant more flowers. Go out there and help restore the habitat that's degrading, and give the bees and other pollinators more forage and more habitat. I would say everybody and anybody can do that.
That's an amazing place to end. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.